Got it. Is everyone in? Oh. Kia ora koutou katoa. Thank you for joining our webinar this evening. I'm going to start with a karakia a few of you may recognise. Mahunga ki raro. Manawa mai te Māori nuku. Manawa mai te Māori rangi. Ko te Māori ka ao, he Māori te poa. Ka pakaru mai te pō. Tau mai te Māori, haumie, huie, taikie. Embrace the energy from the earth, embrace the energy from the sky. The energy I have gathered is strong and destroys darkness. Come, great energy, join, gather, it is done. Ko Sarita taku ingoa no tamaki makaurau hau. I'm the Executive Officer of Child Poverty Action Group, and I'm really delighted to welcome you here all tonight. No mai, haere mai.
No, I don't know how to get there.
Is entitled, Why is Early Childhood Care and Education so unaffordable and inaccessible? The interest and the hundreds of sign-ups to this webinar in a really short time of promotion tells us this topic is of interest to many of us in Aotearoa. And as a parent of a 3-year-old myself, it's no wonder. Regardless of who you are or what part of Aotearoa you are in, the cost of preschool education is a burden, when ECEC should be a joy. So Child Poverty Action Group believes early childhood care and education, ECCE, is a public good. And so just like our primary and secondary schools, here's a radical idea. It should be free, which is why we're talking about this as part of our election series. It gives me great pleasure to introduce 3 phenomenal speakers tonight to share their insights into the way the early childhood care and education sector is structured, who is benefiting, and how it could be changed to put tamariki at the centre. First up, you'll hear from Michelle Duff. So many of you might know, Michelle is a highly regarded journalist and author whose investigations have covered social issues with a primary focus on health, maternity, and sexual violence. Last year, she wrote a series on the early childhood sector for Stuff, which ended up being 15 articles. So outlining the problems that exist, and tonight she'll share some of what she's uncovered with you. Then we're thrilled to welcome Dr. Sophie Merlin from the University of Auckland. Originally from the UK, Sophie is a former senior policy advisor in the British Prime Minister's Strategy Unit. She has written about her of the New Zealand early childhood sector since arriving in our country, and she's going to really bring a global lens to tonight's webinar, and will explain how the New Zealand model differs from some countries where early childhood is much easier on parents and on children. And our third and final speaker tonight is Dr. Jenny Ritchie, an associate professor at Te Hiranga Waka, University of Victoria University of Wellington. She's based in the School of Education there. So Jenny has over 30 years experience as a scholar of early childhood care and education. Her teaching, research and writing have focused on supporting early childhood educators and teacher educators. She's also Child Poverty Action Group's spokesperson on early childhood matters and has been involved in several research papers for CPAG, as well as most recently, she's actually written our policy brief, which outlines how policymakers could improve the sector for both children and teachers. So we're thrilled to have her here tonight and all of our speakers. As you can see, it's an impressive lineup, and yeah, we're getting in for a treat. So we hope there'll be some time at the end of the speakers' talks for a couple of partai. We'll open up the chat function probably towards the end of Jenny's talk, and then try and get through a couple of questions that way. But now I'll hand over to Michelle to begin our talk this evening. Over to you, Michelle.
Kia ora koutou, can you all hear me? Okay, thank you for that generous introduction, Sarita, and thank you so much to the Child Poverty Action Group for inviting me to talk about my investigative project, which I am quite proud of. It did take, I think I was the best part of a year I spent investigating childcare, and I'm really out of what we managed to uncover during this would be fantastic. Many would investigate childcare for a while. And I think what tipped me over the edge was moving to Te Whanganui Aotearoa about 1.5 years ago with my then 2.5-year-old, and just the struggle that I found in finding childcare for him. So I had a spreadsheet. I think I visited more than a dozen places, and there was just so much variation in terms of quality, you know, in terms of how everything had a wait list, and if it didn't have a wait list, also have others. So look, there had been a lot of work done reporting into early childcare, and I can also see a lot of some of you on this webinar who have, you know, advocated for early childcare for years, and I just want to mihi to you as well. And, you know, there was a lot of people that helped me with this work. But one of the things I wanted to do was to try and really tell this from a parent's perspective, you know, to see what people out there in the community were finding. And also I used the Official Information Act and other sort of open source data to just quantify how bad the problem was. So if I can try and share my screen here. Can you all see that? Yep. So I guess one of the first places I wanted to start with was this 20 hours free, or this 20 hours policy that was brought in by Labor in around 2007, just to see how impactful that actually was and how parents were finding childcare now. And what became clear really early was that essentially, since it was introduced, this is the CPI childcare, so the Consumer Price Index for childcare. And we can see that when the policy came into play in 2007, there was an immediate bump. Childcare did become more affordable, you know, particularly for parents of over 3s. But over time, since then, it just has it's been completely swallowed up. There's been a 50% increase. So that essentially that policy we're back where we were, you know, in 2007. So this, you can't see it on this graph, but this is actually worse for low income earners as well. It's gone up higher. So it's gone up, you know, yeah, in that time it's been higher for them, the increase. And the Ministry of Social Development, when I was doing this research, also sort of commissioned its own research to find out that our childcare is actually the least affordable in the developed world, in OECD countries. So I'd found out that, yes, it was obviously a big issue for you know, the data showed that. So the next thing I did was I went to the community to talk to some of these parents. So I went through various different networks, visited childcare centres, and this here is Maima Tapumania, who, when I went to see her Samoan language ECE that her daughter Litia went to was closing down. That was out in Pororua, and the centre was actually closing down because the owner had planned to move overseas. But she said that, you know, it had become more and more difficult for her, offering, you know, pretty low cost fees to a lot of these whānau. It had become more and more difficult for her to run this centre. And when I talked to Maima, she had gone to see 8 daycares she'd been to see, and none of them had any sort of availability for her child. She was working 16-hour shifts at Kenepuru Hospital as a nurse, and she had to get her parents to come over from Samoa to look after Litia until she could try and find some kind of childcare. So, you know, this is the kind of situation that many of these parents were in. And just looking at this is data from Education Counts. So that's the Ministry of Education's data. And we can see that, you know, childcare is certainly not equally accessible around the country. This is graph of the hardest 15 places to find daycare, and we can see that some of those are really low income areas as well, and high sort of Māori and Pacifica ethnicities, so places like Aotearoa or Wairoa or Pōtiki. Yeah, so definitely a real variation in being able to find childcare. It's also really a gendered issue and a very feminist issue, I think, because this is from research done by the Ministry for Women, actually. And Isabel Sin from Motu Research did these 3 amazing studies. So it shows that, yeah, women take a huge hit from lack of access to childcare, and, you know, obviously their children as well. And this is worse for single mums. It's worse for Māori and Pacifica. And it's just, it's just very, very difficult for many of these women to find daycare. This was Renata Kotua, who moved to Palmerston North, had visited 14 centres to try and find a spot for her baby, who was then 10 months. And she ended up having to move back to Auckland, where she could actually find daycare for her child. This was Jennifer, she's from Wellington, actually, and her issue wasn't so much in being able to find the daycare, but it was that she had twins. So 2, when I talked to her, they'd just turned 3, so they did get some subsidy in their childcare, but she was paying more than $1,000 a week for both of them. So just, you know, for a lot of these parents out there, it was just so difficult to, you know, to work, they had to make sacrifices. Often it was the women who would have to sacrifice, you know, working or pick up part-time jobs, or sometimes that wasn't even worth it. So here's the OECD, the most recent OECD figures that I could find for affordability, which shows that New Zealand, although we actually do have one of the highest funding rates per capita in the world, we also are one of the least, if not the least affordable. So I guess the next thing to get to after finding all this out was to sort of try and figure out why this was. And, you know, there are kind of a number of reasons. There's been a hodgepodge of policies really since the 20 hours ECE policy was brought in that 2007. It was kind of layered over the already existing policy that was there for subsidies for under 1-year-olds. So what that kind of did is it meant that there was more funding now for 3 to 5-year-olds, and there was funding for under 1s, but then there was this big gap, you know, between the ages of 2 and 3, which, you know, they were just not receiving anywhere near the same amount of subsidy, which meant that a lot of centres were sort of struggling because that age group still needs a lot of care. So there was that. There was also the fact that, so the historical anomalies in funding, and also some of the issues around just the money that has been put into ECE over time, you know, had either been frozen, particularly, I suppose, during the last national government for that 9 years. There really was not much movement in funding at all. And Sue Cherrington from Victoria University has done a lot of work on this as well. And then when funding sort of was increased, it was just to inflation. So, you know, there really has not been a big cash injection for some time. And then the other thing over time is that the sector, this is the graph I'm talking about. So over time, the sector has become, you know, increasingly privatized. So a lot of the, you know, initially there were a lot more community-based sort of not-for-profit centres, and it kind of, there is quite a little bit of a crossover when that 23 hours and was brought in 2007, that you know, some of those really big businesses have just are starting to dominate the market share. And in fact, when I did an Official Information Act into this to find out exactly how much that was happening, we can see that, yeah, 2.3 billion funding for ECE, and 450 million of that is going to the biggest, or to the 4 biggest entities actually. So yeah, there is a lot of money that is going into centres that, you know, a lot of people who I talked to said, you know, they have investors, and they have, you know, some of them have shareholders that they have to answer to. And certainly there were places that I found where, you know, there had been a lot of sort of provisional licenses, a lot of issues with quality, although the research doesn't show there's any difference in quality between for-profit and not-for-profit centres. You know, there were concerns, and continue to be concerns from the sector, that, you know, if there is a profit motive, then that, you know, is something that is of concern. So look, I feel like I've done pretty well in trying to sum that up in the allotted time. So hopefully that made sense. And yeah, looking forward to hearing from the others and taking any questions at the end, I guess. Kia ora. Sorry, I'm back to introduce the next person, who is Sophie Milan from the University of Auckland. Sorry, Sophie.
That's all right, Michelle. I didn't know that you or Sarita were going to segue, but that's fine. Thank you very much. It's such an honor to have you do it. Yeah, no, Michelle's investigative report up here has been hugely important, actually, in uncovering these patterns that, you know, nobody else had done this work in academia or elsewhere, and it's hugely revealing case of, you know, the effects of privatization. And you've got kind of both the hard numbers of following the money, but also those really personal stories from struggling parents all around the country. So I think it's extremely powerful work. So thank you for that. So, you know, there are lots of problems with the sector that Michelle has outlined. These are not specific to New Zealand. I wish I could, you know, say the story from, you know, my experience in the UK government, but it was doing better on that. And in fact, it's actually a very, very similar story. Also in Australia, many people know that case. So I'm going to talk about examples of countries that have got this a lot better. And about you know, examples of how can public early childhood education systems overcome some of those issues that Michelle has outlined with the system in Aotearoa, and achieve so much better outcomes for children. And interestingly, point I'm going to make, better value of money for taxpayers, which are also parents too.
Sorry to interrupt, Sophie. Would you mind just turning your volume up a little bit, please?
Sure.
Your microphone. Thank you.
Yeah, can you hear me on the mic? I realize these headphones don't have a mic, so I'm just using the computer. Is that better?
Maybe just turn up your computer volume.
Yeah,
your mic volume, if it's possible. Thanks.
Where's the mic? I'm not sure how to turn up the mic volume, but I've turned up the volume to max.
That seems better.
Hey, yeah, is that better? Okay, thanks.
Yeah,
sorry about that.
Good.
Okay, so first case I'm going to talk about is Denmark. So there's another country with a team of about 5 million, world-class fjords, significant history of female political leadership at senior levels, but no one pays more than 30% of the cost of their childcare at any age. Children are enrolled in a childcare place at the end of a generous parental leave. Ground attached to every center. There's a focus on unstructured play, children actively helping as part of a center community. There's exploratory, focus on exploratory outdoor play, regardless of the weather, cold and dark in Denmark too. A healthy hot lunch is prepared for the children. Their teachers have a 3-year training in child development education. They're supported by an ongoing body, a professional body with ongoing professional training and development that does that work for them, the training. And so we can imagine how personally as parents, that amazing that would be. We can see people Googling English language jobs and immigration opportunities in Copenhagen now. But we can also sort of see benefits to actually having this childcare system, for the country and for society as a whole. If we look like in 2019, late it's kind of pre-pandemic. What we do know is the pandemic has only sort of exacerbated these trends. But in 2019, over 70% of mothers were employed full-time in Denmark, and that compares to less than half of mothers employed full-time in New Zealand. And this is also because full-time in Denmark does mean 35 to 40 hours. It's not with generous holiday time. It's not the 80-hour week. And we see this particularly in the early years. So 85% of mothers whose youngest child is aged between 3 and 5 is employed in Denmark, full or part-time, and that compares to 70 under 2. Again, it's this 10 percentage point difference. 75% of mothers employed with children under 2 in Denmark, compared with 65% in New Zealand. That's full or part-time. So this is like a 10 percentage point difference, which is actually huge. And if we think we really care about like 1 or 2% male unemployment, right, will really shape a political debate. Here we're talking about 10% of the female population. And that's hugely significant, obviously, in terms of this is the gender point that Michelle drew out in terms of women professions in public life. But it's also significant because this gender inequality is so crucial in terms of family income inequality, and in particular in addressing child poverty, which is why Child Poverty Action Group has organised this seminar. And we know that, in New Zealand, nearly 1 in 3 kids with a single mother is poor. New Zealand is experiencing material deprivation in what is a rich country of 5 million. In Denmark, that figure is 7%. So even with a single mother, so maximum of 1 income in the household, a female income, it's still able to lower child poverty. Clearly, child income support's a big part of that, and the New Zealand baby bonus has come some way to help that. But childcare is the other big part of that. And so families, with this public childcare system are able to, parents are able to really offer their children a very different level of stress, very different level of food, security, routine, rhythm, all these things that are important for children, regardless of their background, and that I think all parents and for now want to offer their Tamariki. So, this is the example of Denmark. And so maybe you're not convinced that Aotearoa can kind of move that way. Perhaps we don't have the income tax level, we don't have the wealth tax, although they actually don't have wealth tax, they're very high income tax. We don't have the oil resources, and we don't have that history. This didn't happen in the 70s. We haven't had the feminists really pushing those labor unions and establishing that social democracy in the 70s. So I want to go next over to America, and specifically to the state of Oklahoma. And there's the musical, we'll start singing along. And this is, you probably know, is a very conservative American state. So even by American standards, it is off the scale on kind of many right-wing indicators. So they've almost recently all but banned abortion in all circumstances. The last time they voted for a Democrat for president was in 1964. But despite all this, since 1998, there's been a no-cost pre-kindergarten program. So this is essentially early childhood education public system for all 4-year-olds. It's not as early as comprehensive as some of the Nordic systems and some systems in Germany now, but it is significant. It's full days, full week, and a place for every child as an entitlement, funded by the state in line with school budgets. Lead teachers are required to have a college degree, as well as specialized training in early childhood development. And they all receive the same wage and wage scale as teachers of older children. They're employees of the local education service as well. And economists have studied the effects of this program in Oklahoma over time. One of the key things they found was that children from lower income families, families with less education themselves, did much better educationally. And we could see these effects as late as 8th grade, which is about like age 13 or 14. So these huge effects of this early, often because they're focusing on these sort of social and emotional skills, but this has lasting benefits in terms of literacy, numeracy, and exam test scores right through up to high school. And we can see how that sort of really eases the burdens on primary schools and in some cases secondary schools. And then, of course, other public services down the line that flow from that. And they also found that the introduction of this, remember, this is just for a year, this is just sort of 4 to 5, there's still, a very privatized system for the under 4s. But this significantly increased the chances that mothers worked. And interestingly, it also at the same time found that programs increased the time that mothers actually spent with their children on activities, including reading. Mothers that have more of a break, more engaged, more support in their parenting and education can actually do better at home as well. We know separately from other programs in the US, like Peri Preschool, more intensive programs, for low-income families, is a really significant long-term benefits, not just in education, but in crime reduction, wages and earnings that flow on from that. And for the higher income families, what we saw in Oklahoma was there was a shift. So people did, they enrolled their kids in these public pre-K programs. And that really significantly reduced costs for those families too. So that also supported, when I say higher income, I mean all but lower income, just like the rich. And it didn't worsen education for those kids. And that's really key, because we have seen that when government has subsidized big childcare expansions, such as in Quebec and Canada, you have actually seen quite negative impacts in terms of key indicators of child behavior, social and emotional development, which we know has long-term problems. So all in all, this has significant, the Oklahoma public model has significantly reduced these inequalities, these educational inequalities that children are exposed to. And what's interesting is that even though these programs were universal, they were for people regardless of income or minority status, they did better than the programs that were just targeted on those low-income families. Now, research doesn't actually tell us why that is, but there's some good theories out there, whether it's because we've got mixed ability classes, the mixed income classes, the people, so the fact that it can attract good teachers, attract and retain good teachers that are working across those mixed groups. But really, it's these public universal programs where we see the biggest impact, even for the lowest income children. And so this kind of public model is one that Elizabeth Warren and others, as you may know, are pushing Biden to enact nationally, and including at earlier ages, and having this bit like the Danish system, having this essentially this cap on the amount that that childcare is costing parents, about 25-30% cap on that. So it's worth noting here that proposals that Biden has pushed, and he hasn't got this through, are more ambitious than than what any political party is putting forward in Aotearoa at the moment. And I know Jenny Richardson talk about what policies are in play and what policies could be in play. But what I will say is that there are examples of cities and states, again, including in the United States, which is already spends on nationally or federally a much smaller amount on early childhood education than we do here in New Zealand, Aotearoa. It's actually one of the relatively big spenders across the OECD on childcare. It's just not going to teachers, it's not going to low ratios, it's not going to quality places for children. And I think some of the story around the privatization, Michelle, gives you some insight about where that money is going. And it is possible to kind of move to this public system with this ambitious policy. So in 2014 in New York City, Bill de Blasio, the mayor, one of his big election promises that won him the mayorship there was early childhood education for all. There's pre-K for all. And they were able to sort of enact this like within a year or two. They rapidly recruited like 2,000 qualified teachers to deliver on this political commitment. And it could do this because it was using the public system through the local education bodies and capabilities that it already had. It had the scale as a whole city. New York City is probably, I think it's like 9 million. So this is like nearly twice the size of New Zealand in the state. But they could offer starting salaries, just pay people more, pay teachers more to attract them, pay them more than the national average. It's expensive to work in your city, so pay them more. It's not magic. This is what the market is supposed to do, but it hasn't in this sector. They worked with the local public university, which they were already funding, to ensure that they could create enough training spaces to prepare and develop teachers ready for the classroom. And what they could do in this area was not just reduce costs for parents straight on, but actually slow the cost of the thing about inflation costs, right? Actually slow the cost of a big area of spending for families, which is childcare. And again, as people know, childcare teachers are also parents themselves, and so their wages directly affect family incomes too. So you're really addressing kind of this cost of living crisis, this child poverty at its root, really, if you like, with this public childcare system. So I'll just say a little bit about what I think are common and totally understandable concerns with these more public approaches. So these are affordability and choice for parents, right? So this is what we will hear come back on this, and I think these are valid concerns. I'd be very interested in the Q&A to have so Michelle and Jenny can also talk about this. But the first is affordability. Is this just the pipe dream? Can we really afford this? And I think it's worth just reiterating again that New Zealand is actually expending just below the OECD average on childcare. That include weighted by country, so that includes like Denmark, New Zealand, and they're still paying less than 1% of GDP on early childhood, right? It's small fry, right, for the outcomes that you're going to get here. And they're already doing 20 hours a week. There's plans to extend this, as Jenny will elaborate, to 2-year-olds. Why not ensure we just get value for money of that, right? And again, it's also about thinking long term about productivity and growth, and this really is an investment, not just in education for children, but in the productivity with enabling others to maintain engagement with the labour market. And these effects really are long term. We know that investing in early childhood education is one of the best investments a government can make in terms of long-term outcomes for children. Economist James Hetman talks about it as a really human capital investment, and shows that, you know, every dollar that you spend is worth much more spending it on the under fives or under sixes than it is spending it down the line. Not that we don't want to also spend on, you know, our young Tamariki young adults as well, but that really that, you know, dollar for dollar, this is the time when it really matters. So the second point, so that's affordability. The second point is really around, you know, offering parents choice and diversity. And I think this is one of the things that really comes out from Michelle's spin-off pieces, is that, you know, this private market hasn't delivered choice. It's actually reduced choice for parents. You know, there are a range of different providers with different styles of education that meeting different cultural needs for Pacific families, for Asian immigrants. It really is becoming the standard model of those top four providers. And people aren't able to do that. The ones that have got more innovative approaches have gone to the wall. And this is sort of, even if you have a place, you know, people aren't even able to really think about and choose about quality of childcare for the place. They're just trying to find what they can get. And yeah, and one of the benefits of public system and this enrollment, just like school, is it reduces a lot of this complexity and burden on parents. Parents don't want to be like, you know, juggling and controlling, you know, a day here, a day there, a day with grandma, you know, a day with nan, a day at this childcare center, and then switching around. And then, you know, this is also a problem that doesn't provide stability for children or for childcare workers, or for parents trying to work. And lastly, you know, the point is the centres shouldn't, you know, they don't need to be run from Wellington. Like, so in the Denmark example I talked about, you know, so this has been a public system since the mid-70s, but yet, you know, we still have 30%, you know, independent, not-for-profit providers, right? And genuinely not-for-profit for people that know this area. And you know, clearly this is
Sophie.
yeah.
Sorry. I'm just checking on the time, and it's really interesting. So I'm like wanting to keep going, but I know that Jenny.
I'll pass on to Jenny. But yeah, last one was just that, you know, I just think optimistically that, you know, we have got this. New Zealand has got a good starting point with its Te Whāteriki curriculum for early childhood. It just needs the centres to deliver it.
Thanks so much, Sophie. And I'm sure there's going to be a lot of questions at the end as well for you as well. So I'll hand over to Jenny.
Can I just be made a host, please? Sorry, just so I can share.
I think you are the host. Yeah,
I am now. Good. Yeah, no, I had to go in and out because of my laptop issues. Sorry, everybody. Kia ora tātou. So lovely to see so many familiar people have joined tonight. Such an interesting and important conversation that we're having, and hopefully we'll still have a little bit of time for some discussion. Just bring that back. Okay, so this is briefly what I'm going to cover in 10 short minutes. Firstly, the myth of New Zealand being this wonderful place to raise children, our CPAG recommendations, a quick look at current government and other party election promises and policies, and then some discussion towards what can we do? What do we need to do about this situation that's been highlighted by both Michelle and Sophie? So I think it's kind of interesting to put where we're at now in a context. We had this wonderful egalitarian progressivism that came out a century ago after the Great Depression, where we had these cradle to the grave assurances of a social welfare contract of a state that would look after everyone, including its most vulnerable, with financial support. And that in the last probably 3 decades, that's been undermined by increasingly kind of privatization and user pays of neoliberal policies, social and economic policies, which have really exacerbated wealth inequality in Aotearoa. Our compulsory schooling sector has remained free of charge, but as we've just been hearing, the early childhood sector has become largely privatized and is also dominated by large corporate for-profit providers, unlike the school sector. And this is really a market failure in that we've left our most important vulnerable future leaders, children of this nation, to the market. And it's not, as Michelle's work has shown, it's really not equitable at all in terms of access and expense. And this is a quote from a recent Education Review Office report. The data from our reports highlights the disparity and inequitable provision of quality education and care. This is particularly evident in our akanuku assurance reviews, which are the sort of basic ones, where poor quality provision and a lack of regard for children's health, safety and welfare is more likely to be found in our communities with high levels of participation of Māori and Pacific children. So that's just really perpetuating inequality in a very sad way. So in our CPAG policy brief, we had a number of recommendations. Just to sort of quickly summarize, our first two recommendations were to really look at where we're needing to find the gaps and close the gaps of availability and fund new provision of community-based, not-for-profit centres, including kohanga reo, other Māori language immersion settings and Pacific language nests. And then we also, I thought, really importantly, we wanted to make early childhood care and education free in the not-for-profit services, and which I call the community-based services. And I think that that should be a right as it is for children when they turn age 5, that they get free schooling. And I also think that because we have this over 60% privatisation, we need to provide pathways for those services that are currently in that for-profit or corporate space to including the ones that have somehow managed to get charitable status, to change and transform them to become not-for-profit community-based services, because that's what is going to do what needs to be done in the sense of providing access to quality that's not sending profits into shareholders' pockets. And we also need to really work around providing high quality, culturally responsive provision, because we've got a very mixed bag out there in terms of having centres with qualified teachers and good ratios of teachers to children, particularly for the under 2s. And the other thing that is quite problematic is the very large group sizes, where I don't think it's possible to have high quality. So there's some more recommendations in the policy brief, but that's a brief overview. And now to the election policies. So their family boost policy is a tax rebate of $75 maximum per week for families earning under 140,000. Labor, their budget 2023, they are increasing funding subsidies for early childhood centres, and they're extending the 20 hours subsidy to 2-year-olds, which I think is quite significant. The Green Party have actually stated in a press release that they see early childhood care and education as a public good, which is great, I think. They want to invest in community childcare and ensure all children have access to quality care options. They'll also extend the 20 hours to 2-year-olds, and they'll redesign the Working for Families scheme. The Opportunities Party, they let us know, they sent us a letter saying, we support 100% your critique of the early childhood sector and share all of the concerns. They had a concern re-extending the 20 hours to 2-year-olds, however. They prefer to give parents more choice via a universal basic income and empower them to learn. So I'm not quite sure who they're empowering, the parents or the children, but anyway, ACT, they won't do much. They said early childhood education will continue to function as it presently does, but they're going to kind of give out funding vouchers, which they're calling the student education accounts, which will be equivalent to that currently available through the 20 hours free program. New Zealand First don't mention early childhood at all. So this is where we come to what we're going to do about this, everyone. So I think we need to strongly advocate for high quality, culturally responsive care and education. We need to encourage everybody we know, firstly, to vote, and secondly, to make an informed choice in the policies that they read and choose to vote for. And I think we need to take up opportunities wherever we can for lobbying our local politicians. And I also think we can use social media if we are and do have time to do social media things to highlight the importance of actually a very thoughtful vote, and to raise awareness around the plight of what's happening in our early childhood sector. And I also think we need to advocate for children and young people's voices to have a say in what's important to them and what works best for them. So that's my little 10-minute piece.
Okay, well, I'm just going to come in now, Jenny, with a question for you, if that's okay, if we've got time. I know we're going slightly over. This is a question from Michelle. She's specifically asking about teacher qualifications. And she says, looking at the research of all the countries that we've discussed, they only appear to have qualified lead teachers, which is not the case in New Zealand. And this is why the costs of education and care are so significant. I wasn't sure whether that meant about the cost to parents, but I suppose some research should be undertaken to review the quality of teaching qualifications, and which are controlled by the Teaching Council. And is teaching only qualifications a proven measure of quality? So I guess that question is about, is the Teaching Council keeping an eye on qualifications, and centres bound to employ qualified teachers?
Yeah, it's interesting. I've actually heard Sandra Collins from Aotearoa saying that it's hard to tell, whether teaching qualifications make a difference, and I'm sure they must do. And yet, I don't think there's not very much research about that. With regard to the Teaching Council, they approve the teaching qualifications that we have to, teacher education providers have to go through quite a rigorous process to have a teaching qualification approved by the council. And then once they're approved, that means that people that graduate from that qualification can then be registered as teachers. So there are sort of quite a number of checks and balances in the teacher education sphere, and also with teachers. Once they graduate, they have 2 years of a probationary period, and then they can become, where they're provisionally registered, and then they become fully registered, and also have to conduct their own kind of ongoing evaluations with support of colleagues on a regular basis. So there are quite a few checks and balances in that space, but currently we only have to have 50% of teachers in an early childhood setting with a qualification, which is quite a big backtrack. We're already up to 2008, after the 2002 Labour government's strategic plan, we were already at 80% qualified. But when the National Party came in 2008, they lowered it from 80% down to 50%, which we've sat at ever since, even though all Labour, Greens, and even National, I think, we're going to commit to, at the last election, to returning to 100% eventually. But starting with 80%, we're still only officially required to have 50% qualified teachers currently, which is problematic, I think.
Thank you. Okay, and the next question is for you, Michelle, if you're still there. It's from Colleen about, and I can see you've answered it in the chat, but if you have any experience of how hard it is for parents of disabled children, I know we often hear stories in the media in terms of having parents who have had children excluded, or they haven't been able to find a place, even harder than able-bodied children or children without disabilities. So can you tell us a bit about that, please?
Kia ora, yes, and aroha mai, I should have mentioned this actually in the beginning when I did say that it's, obviously it's more difficult for some groups, and I think you could definitely include the parents of disabled children in that group. So anecdotally, yes, I had heard stories of the parents of disabled children having a real struggle to find quality ECE, or being able to keep their children in ECE, or So, and I did have a story set up with some beautiful parents up in Tauranga, but unfortunately it didn't quite work out. So, but I think that Colleen, and unfortunately also, I now no longer work for Stuff, I'm freelancing. So this particular series, I could have kept on banging on about this for, forever. Still now I would be if I was there. So there was a long list, and this was one of the issues that unfortunately I just didn't get to, but I think someone should. And I've just been talking to Colleen. I think the doing a very empowering, helpful article for the parents of these children would be great. And I think that yeah, it should be done. I'm just sorry I didn't get to it.
Thanks, Michelle. I was just seeing there was one question from a teacher who works at a privately owned centre, but it's a mum and dad type business, and obviously they're not one of the big players. So, Jenny, do you or I think Sophie's had to go, but Jenny or Michelle, do you have any thoughts about whether or not there's a place for these sorts of centres who are obviously struggling to make ends meet? They don't have the economies of scale of some of the bigger providers, but is there a place for those sorts of business owners?
I think there is. I think that there can, I think that I know of people that run their own small scale centres, and they do struggle financially as well. But because they've been previously been kindergarten teachers and just wanted to have more freedom to do things outside of the oversight of an association, things like that. So I think that there is a place for that. My concern is more with the corporatized, large scale kind of baby barn provision that I don't think provides very good quality for children.
Okay, cool. Well, I think that pretty much wraps it up, but we've gone slightly over time, but I'm just going to hand over to Sarita now.
Kia ora all. Yeah, so that kind of finishes up our webinar for this evening, and just a few things. Oh yeah, cool. So our webinar was early childhood care and education in Aotearoa and why it's so expensive and inaccessible. And I just wanted to, give a huge thank you to our speakers, Michelle Duff, Dr. Sophie Millen, and Dr. Jenny Ritchie. I know you'll all agree with me that their talks have been thought-provoking, illuminating, and we're just really grateful that they've, shared their time, expertise, and knowledge with us in this kind of free webinar in this way. So on behalf of all of us, really thank you guys. And to all of you who've participated here tonight as, the parents, caregivers, grandparents, teachers, kako, and all of you that's interested in the sector, thank you as well for taking the time to come along and learn a bit more. So anyway, we will be sending out a bit of a toolbox in the coming days by email for all of you wanting to know how we can actually keep this conversation going and make some change. And before I just close off, I'll just finish with a karakia. Kia whakaarea te tapu, kia waiatea ai te ara, kia turuku whakatahi ai, kia turuku whakatahi ai, haumea huie taikie. Restrictions are moved aside so the pathway is clear to return to everyday activities. Pamare everyone, thank you all.